Good morning, Colonel. The judge's voice didn't fill the courtroom so much as silence it. Every sound, the shuffling of papers, the hum of the ceiling fans, the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers, stopped at once, as if the room itself had held its breath. Nobody moved. Not the clerk, not the three expensive attorneys sitting across from me, not my daughter Anna, 3 rows back, who I heard inhale sharply, and certainly not Evelyn Carter, my mother-in-law, who had been wearing that polished country club smile since the moment I walked through the courtroom door. The smile she wore whenever she believed she'd already won. That smile didn't just fade, it cracked. Beneath $200 worth of concealer, Evelyn went pale. Her eyes found mine across the courtroom like she was staring at a stranger who had somehow stolen my face and sat down in my chair. "Wait," she whispered, then louder, turning toward her attorney. "What?" I kept my hands folded calmly on the defense table and said nothing. 20 years in military courtrooms teaches you this much. The loudest person in the room almost always has the weakest case. And Evelyn Carter had been very, very loud for a very long time. 3 months earlier, I was making chicken soup. It was a cold Tuesday in April, the kind of raw Virginia spring rain that finds the spaces in your coat and settles deep into aging joints. My knees were already aching. I remember that clearly because the knock at the door surprised me, and I moved too quickly, and I paid for it. The certified letter had a return address I recognized immediately: Carter and Bellamy Legal Group. I set it on the kitchen counter, turned off the burner, sat down. My husband Frank had died the previous December after 14 months of cancer that took everything from him slowly, systematically, and without mercy. Since then, every interaction with his family had carried a quiet hostility beneath the surface, polite enough in public, sharp enough in private. Evelyn criticizing the flowers I chose for the funeral, suggesting I'd sold Frank's fishing boat too hastily, telling relatives I was unstable with grief whenever I disagreed with her version of events. I had learned to expect it. What I hadn't expected was a lawsuit. Petition for estate review, allegation of undue influence, property dispute. I read those words twice before I understood what they meant. Then I understood completely. The lake house. It sat on a quiet stretch of Smith Mountain Lake where Frank and I had spent nearly every summer for 32 years. Not grand, just a cedar cabin with creaking floors, faded green shutters, and a dock Frank had rebuilt twice with his own 2 hands. It wasn't worth much by Evelyn's standards. By mine, it was everything. Toward the end of Frank's illness, the lake house was the only place he slept without waking up screaming. He'd sit on that dock wrapped in a navy blanket I'd bought him at a naval station gift shop 20 years ago, and I'd read beside him in the morning light. Sometimes we went an hour without speaking. We didn't need words anymore. We had something beyond that. And now Evelyn wanted it. And according to her lawyers, she intended to prove I'd manipulated her dying son into leaving it to me. I set the letter down on the counter. I laughed not because it was funny, but because at 62 years old, betrayal becomes so predictable it almost loses the power to shock you. Almost. People make a particular mistake about quiet women, especially quiet women of a certain age. We become invisible in America past 60, cashiers look through us, doctors finish our sentences for us, young professionals explain things we mastered decades ago while calling us sweetheart. I had grown used to it. After retirement, I even preferred it. Invisibility has its advantages. But Evelyn mistook silence for helplessness. That was her first mistake. Her second was believing she knew who she was dealing with. "You should just settle," my daughter told me that same evening. We sat at my kitchen table while the rain continued outside. Anna looked exhausted in the way that only women managing too many impossible things at once ever look. Divorce still fresh, 2 teenagers, a job that barely covered the bills, and now this. "Grandma Evelyn has money," she said carefully. "Lawyers, connections, I don't want you going through this kind of stress." I stirred my tea. "I know. She says the house belongs in the Carter family." I looked up. I was Frank's family. Anna's face softened immediately. "I know, Mom," but she still sounded afraid. I understood why. What she didn't know, what most people didn't know, was what I had done before retirement. Frank and I had agreed long ago to keep my military career private outside our closest circle. Not secret exactly, just separate. After 2 decades of tribunals, overseas investigations, and enough human ugliness to fill several lifetimes, I want peace. I wanted a garden, books, coffee on the porch, the particular quiet that comes from ordinary mornings. For a while I had that. Until Evelyn Carter dragged me back into court. A week after the lawsuit arrived, Evelyn hosted Sunday dinner. That alone was a signal. She never hosted unless there was an audience to perform for. Her home overlooked the Elizabeth River, white columns, polished silver, the kind of house designed to remind you of your place relative to hers. I walked in already knowing what to expect. The performance had started before I arrived. Frank's brother Richard barely made eye contact. His wife Sandra gave me one of those tight little smiles that wealthy people deploy when they're trying to appear decent while behaving terribly. Dinner crawled forward through a parade of passive aggression dressed as concern. "You must be overwhelmed financially," Evelyn said, carving her roast with surgical precision. "After everything." "I'm managing." Legal matters can become terribly expensive. She let that sit. Across the table, Richard leaned back in his chair. Dad always intended that property to stay in the Carter bloodline. "Frank made his wishes very clear," I said. Evelyn dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. "That's what your lawyers claim." Her lawyers, interesting phrase at that point. I hadn't hired any. I understood then what she truly believed, that I would panic, retreat, disappear quietly, sell the house, lose gracefully, vanish back into widowhood like a good, forgettable woman. Evelyn set down her fork and studied me across the candlelight. "You know what your problem has always been, Margaret." I waited. "You always acted like you were smarter than everyone else." She smiled. "But at the end of the day, you were just a housewife." Sandra shifted visibly. Anna stared at her plate. That sentence hurt not from pride, but because of what it erased. Frank had known exactly what I'd given to my years of service. The sacrifices, the nightmares, the weight I still carried quietly. He had respected every bit of it. And now he was gone, and his mother was rewriting the story. I set my fork down without a sound. "I'll see you in court, Evelyn." She laughed softly, elegantly. "Oh, Margaret, you're finished." That night I sat alone on my porch, listening to thunder rolling across the water. I thought about Frank, about the oath I had taken decades ago, about the young soldiers I'd prosecuted, and the innocent ones I'd defended, and the long hours between when truth and outcome were not the same thing. Eventually, I went inside and opened the old leather case at the back of my closet. My commission papers, my military records, the Silver Eagle insignia I hadn't touched since retirement. I held it in my palm for a long time, turning it slowly. Then I smiled, not with anger, not with revenge, with something quieter than both. Certainty. For the first time since Frank died, I remembered exactly who I was. The morning of the hearing, I woke before sunrise without an alarm. My body still remembered pressure before my mind did. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark with black coffee while Norfolk lay quiet around me. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement. On the table beside my mug, one plain brown leather folder. No expensive briefcase. No dramatic tower of paperwork, just enough. The people most desperate to appear powerful always carry the heaviest binders. I had learned that lesson 20 years ago. I dressed simply. Gray slacks, navy blouse, dark wool coat. I tied back my silver hair and looked at myself in the hallway mirror. A widow, a grandmother. A woman most people would pass in a grocery store without a second glance. Perfect. Anna caught up to me on the courthouse steps, carrying 2 coffees and already wearing the anxious expression she'd been born with. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm breathing." That's not an answer. "At our age," I said, "it's the only guarantee." She laughed despite herself. "That's the thing about daughters, even grown ones still need moments where their mothers sound steady." Inside, I found the Carter contingent spread across the lobby like an occupation. Evelyn in a cream designer suit with pearls large enough to fund someone's mortgage. Richard in tailored charcoal. And surrounding them, three attorneys, all polished, all expensive, all carrying binders thick enough to stop a door. Evelyn spotted me and smiled, that particular smile that never reached her eyes. "Well," she announced to the lobby, "Margaret actually came." One of the attorneys scanned the space behind me, clearly expecting legal counsel. When he realized I was alone, something shifted in his expression. Predators recognize isolation immediately. "You don't have a lawyer?" Richard asked. "I didn't say that." Evelyn stepped closer. "The perfume arrived first. You should have taken the settlement. And you should have respected your son's wishes." Something hardened in her face. "There it is," she said softly. "That arrogance." "No," I said, "that's grief." For a single moment, just one, I watched something flicker across her expression. Something that might have been discomfort or recognition or the beginning of shame. Then it was gone. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Old wooden benches, an American flag slightly off-center near the bench, the particular smell of old paper, and cold air that every courthouse in America carries like a signature. Evelyn's legal team arranged their materials across their table as if preparing for a corporate acquisition. People glanced at me sideways. The older woman sitting alone at the defense table, no counsel, no binders, nothing but a brown leather folder. I appreciated their assumption. Underestimation is the most useful tool in any courtroom. Anna squeezed my shoulder before taking her seat. "You sure?" I nodded once, and I meant it. Courtrooms had always made sense to me in a way that families never quite did. Family fights are emotional, legal fights are procedural, and procedures can be managed. Judge Harold Bennett entered at exactly 9 o'clock. Late 60s, former Navy Reserve, disciplined posture, eyes that had seen enough not to be easily impressed. The moment he scanned the courtroom, his gaze landed on me and stopped. A pause, small but unmistakable. I watched recognition travel across his face in stages. Confusion, then clarity, then something that looked very much like respect. Evelyn's attorney launched immediately into performance. Tragic case, undue influence, terminally ill man, financially dependent widow, classic framing, the poor wealthy family manipulated by an unstable woman in their most vulnerable moment. He spoke for 10 minutes. Carefully chosen language, emotionally freighted phrasing. At one point he described me as having isolated the deceased during the final stages of illness. Anna stiffened behind me. We both knew the truth. Frank hadn't wanted distance from love. He'd wanted distance from noise, from Evelyn's relentless need to control what she couldn't fix. When the attorney finished, the courtroom practically expected me to weep. Instead, I organized my papers quietly. Judge Bennett looked toward me. "Mrs. Hayes, will you be representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Evelyn's smile bloomed immediately. I could feel her satisfaction from across the room. The judge studied me for a moment longer, and then something changed. His expression deepened, stilled. He sat slightly straighter. "Good morning, Colonel." The room went utterly silent. Evelyn's smile vanished. Richard blinked. One of the attorneys set down his pen, and behind me Anna breathed. "What?" "It's been a long time," the judge said. "Yes, sir," I replied. Evelyn stared at me like the floor had opened. "Colonel," she repeated. The word sat in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. And one by one, I watched realization ripple outward across every face in the room. Nobody moved for several seconds. The court reporter's fingers were still. One of the younger attorneys adjusted his glasses with the careful deliberation of someone buying time to think. And Evelyn looked offended. Not shocked. Offended, as though the world had violated some agreement she hadn't realized existed until this moment. Judge Bennett continued, with the calm of a man for whom surprises had long since lost novelty. "Retired Colonel Margaret Hayes, Judge Advocate General's Corps, over 2 decades of service." The younger attorney swallowed audibly. The older one looked, for the first time all morning, cautious. You were a lawyer, Evelyn said, turning to me as if I'd committed a personal betrayal. Yes. But you said you were retired. I am. You said you worked for the government. I did. Judge Bennett cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, please direct comments through counsel. Evelyn sat back stiffly, but the damage had already begun. Crack by crack, the certainty she'd walked in with was leaving her face. The attorney across from me rallied gamely. Your Honor, while Mrs. Hayes's prior military background is certainly impressive, it remains irrelevant to the property dispute before this court. That was technically true. Rank carries no legal weight in a civil hearing, but credibility carries weight everywhere, and the room had just recalibrated its sense of who I was. When he resumed his opening argument, the rhythm had changed. Before, he'd sounded like a man presenting a guaranteed result. Now he sounded like someone picking his way through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. He returned again to the claim that I'd isolated Frank during his illness. I raised my hand politely. Your Honor, may I respond directly? The judge nodded. You may. I stood, my knees registered their usual protest. I've learned to ignore it. You stated that I isolated my husband during his illness. I looked at the attorney calmly. Did you personally interview his oncology nurses? A pause. No. Did you review hospice visitation records? No. Did you speak with Dr. Levin regarding his treatment recommendations? No. I sat back down, that was all. 3 questions, 30 seconds, no dramatics. But the courtroom understood something now that Evelyn had never grasped. I knew exactly how this worked. The best prosecutors I ever trained with never raised their voices. They asked small, careful questions, questions designed not to attack, but to slowly remove the places someone was hiding. I learned that in Germany in 1991, at 30 years old, terrified half the time and underestimated constantly because I looked too quiet to survive military court. A senior officer told me once, flat out, you don't look like a prosecutor. I told him, criminals usually prefer that. Frank laughed for 20 minutes when I relayed that story later over dinner in our first apartment. God, I missed that laugh. When I submitted Exhibit D, the courtroom changed completely. Judge Bennett reviewed the first page, the second, then he set down his glasses slowly. Interesting, he said, very interesting. Evelyn leaned urgently toward her attorney. What is it? Nobody answered immediately. The older attorney cleared his throat. Where did you obtain this document? From my husband. It was a notarized estate protection letter, signed 8 months before Frank's death. In it, Frank stated clearly and precisely that the lake house belonged solely to me, that any future attempt by family members to contest ownership was contrary to his explicit wishes. And then, most critically, 4 words written in Frank's careful hand. Without coercion or influence. Evelyn went white. That's impossible. No, I said quietly, it's inconvenient. Behind me, Anna covered her mouth. The courtroom shifted. People were no longer looking at me as a grieving widow grasping at her late husband's property. They were looking at Evelyn Carter as a wealthy woman challenging her dying son's clearly documented wishes. Those are very different things. The recess lasted 10 minutes. During the first 2, Evelyn confronted me directly. You hid this. You never asked. You manipulative little. Mrs. Carter, Judge Bennett's voice from the bench was quiet and final. She stopped, but her composure was fracturing fast now, the expensive surface cracking to reveal something raw and frightened underneath. Richard approached me carefully. Margaret, maybe we should discuss settlement. An hour ago, they wanted war. Now they wanted conversation. Your brother already made his decision, I said. He looked away, because on some level, beneath the suit and the family loyalty, he knew that was true. During recess, Anna sat beside me trembling. Mom! I looked at her. You were really a colonel. Retired. You prosecuted military crimes for 20 years, and you never. She shook her head slowly. I don't even know who you are. That one caught in my chest. I touched her hand gently. You know exactly who I am. Her eyes filled. I didn't know all of this. I didn't want it to become my whole identity, I said. After retirement, I wanted ordinary mornings. I was tired of courtrooms deciding people's futures. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, not because she fully understood yet, but because she was beginning to. When court resumed after lunch, I submitted the emails. Frank had written dozens of letters during his illness. Most were personal, some were practical. A few were heartbreakingly honest. The exchange I submitted fell into that last category. Judge Bennett read quietly for nearly a minute before looking up. Mrs. Carter, he said carefully, did you pressure your son to alter his estate arrangements during chemotherapy? Absolutely not. The lie came too quickly, too polished. I'd heard thousands like it. The judge looked at me. Colonel Hayes, page 3. I turned to it calmly. He read, the courtroom waited, then he stopped. Frank's words, in his own handwriting. Mom, if you bring up the lake house again, I will ask hospital staff to restrict your visits. Maggie has been here every single day while you keep talking about property. Anna covered her mouth behind me. Richard closed his eyes. Evelyn stared at the table. Not with shame, with fury. That told me everything I needed to know. I want to be honest. Standing there reading my dead husband's private pain aloud in a public courtroom did not feel like victory. Movies make courtroom moments look triumphant. Clean, satisfying. The truth is heavier. Frank had spent the last months of his life protecting me from his own family. That truth hurt more than any insult Evelyn had ever delivered. He deserved peace. He deserved quiet mornings on that dock. He deserved to die without his property becoming a battlefield. Instead, his final act of love was writing down the truth, so clearly that even a courtroom couldn't misread it. The audio recording was the last piece. During Frank's illness, Evelyn had called constantly, demanding updates, pressuring him about the property, accusing me of controlling his access to the family. Eventually, after one particularly vicious call, Frank asked me to start recording them. Not for revenge, for protection. He understood his mother better than she realized. When the bailiff played the recording, Evelyn's voice filled the courtroom cold and precise. If Margaret really loved you, she'd put the lake house back in the Carter family before you die. Anna went rigid. Richard stared at the floor. Then Frank's voice, exhausted, thin, unmistakable, answered. Mom, stop. 2 words, no dramatics, just a dying man asking for peace from the one person who should have given it freely. Judge Bennett stopped the recording. Nobody spoke. For the first time all day, Evelyn looked old. Not powerful, not polished, not performing, just old. Mrs. Carter, the judge said carefully, this court has serious concerns regarding potential fraudulent conduct and coercive interference with estate matters during a period of documented medical vulnerability. Her attorney leaned in urgently. She stared at me instead. Still trying to understand how the quiet widow she'd mocked had become the most dangerous person in the room. By the 4th day, the atmosphere in the courthouse had changed completely. Security staff greeted me by name. The bailiff held doors. A woman I'd never met stopped me near the drinking fountain to say quietly, "Good for you." I thanked her and meant it, even though I'd spent a lifetime being uncomfortable with public approval. Outside, a handful of local reporters had gathered on the steps. Small Norfolk outlets, nothing national, just the kind of story that travels through retirement communities and diners, through the particular network of people who have lived long enough to appreciate when justice moves slowly but correctly. I ignored them, always had. After watching young soldiers receive folded flags instead of retirement parties, recognition has a way of feeling very small by comparison. I still can't believe you never told me, Anna said quietly as we walked toward the courthouse entrance that last morning. She was carrying my folder again. She'd started doing that somewhere around day 2 without either of us acknowledging it. You told me you worked in legal affairs. That wasn't technically a lie. She gave me a sideways look that was entirely her father's. Mom. I told you enough. You knew I was in the military. You knew I was in law. I thought that meant you processed paperwork. I smiled faintly. Sometimes it did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad knew everything, didn't he? Yes. And he was okay keeping it private. He preferred it. He said my military career made his golf friends nervous. I paused, especially after Bourbon. Anna laughed. That sounds exactly like him. One of them asked what kind of law I practiced. Frank told him, the kind where people go to prison. I could still see the man's face. He nearly dropped his hamburger. Anna laughed again, softer this time, the way people laugh when they're also on the edge of crying. He loved that, she said. Loved watching people underestimate you. He understood the advantage of it. She glanced at me. You miss him extra today. Some days grief sits quietly, other days it walks directly behind your ribs. I looked ahead at the courthouse doors. Courtrooms wake it up. She slipped her arm through mine. We walked inside together. Inside, Evelyn looked diminished. That was the only word that fit. Smaller, not physically, but in the way that people shrink when the story they've told about themselves stops holding together. Her suit still fit perfectly. Her pearls still caught the light. But confidence had abandoned her the way water abandons a cracked vessel, not all at once, steadily, until what's left is just the shape of what used to be full. Richard looked exhausted beside her. Apparently the cracks were spreading beyond the courtroom. Money does that. Once inheritance fights begin, old resentments resurface from wherever families have agreed to keep them buried. Grievances that had spent decades in polite hibernation were apparently waking up throughout the Carter household. Evelyn's attorneys opened the day with another settlement request. This time their tone held something new: urgency. Not the performed urgency of people pretending to offer generosity, but the real kind, the urgency of people who have run the numbers and don't like what they've found. Your Honor, the older attorney began carefully, my client wishes to explore resolution options regarding the lake property. Judge Bennett looked toward me. Colonel Hayes. I stood. No, Your Honor. Evelyn turned sharply. What do you mean, no? I mean your son already resolved this matter before he died. There's room for compromise, she said. The word sounded foreign in her mouth, like a phrase she'd had to practice. No, I said, there isn't. Because it wasn't about compromise anymore. It wasn't about money, or property, or a cedar cabin on Smith Mountain Lake. It was about truth, about the difference between what actually happened and the version Evelyn had been trying to write over it. After months of being painted as a manipulative opportunist, I needed the truth spoken clearly in a public record. Not hidden behind settlement agreements and mutual gag clauses, and the particular gentleman's silence that wealth uses to protect itself. Older people understand that instinct better. When you reach a certain age, your reputation becomes part of your legacy, and Evelyn had tried to destroy mine in the months after I buried my husband. Some things require correction. The ruling came on the 4th morning. Judge Bennett's voice was measured and final. This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the validity of the deceased's stated estate intentions. The petition contesting ownership of the lake property is denied in full. He paused. Furthermore, the court finds credible evidence of coercive conduct toward the deceased during periods of medical vulnerability. While the court will not pursue criminal referral at this stage, let me be absolutely clear. His voice sharpened. What occurred here was deeply inappropriate. He looked down at his notes, then back up. The property remains solely under the ownership of Colonel Margaret Hayes. Outside on the courthouse steps, Anna wept against my shoulder. You won, she whispered. No, I said softly, your father won. Across the plaza, Evelyn stood alone near the curb. Her attorneys walked to separate cars without looking back. No family around her. No one offering comfort. Just the cold Virginia morning and the particular silence of public defeat. I almost kept walking. I had every right to. But I looked at her hands, they were trembling. I crossed the plaza. She looked startled when I stopped beside her. Margaret, her voice had lost its shape somehow. You could still report me. Yes. You'd probably win. Probably. She stared at the pavement for a long moment. Then, quietly, and I believe genuinely, why are you showing me mercy? I looked up at the gray Virginia sky and thought about the answer for a real moment. About the decades I'd spent in courtrooms watching broken people face consequences, about what punishment actually changed and what it didn't. Because you already lost the only thing that mattered, I said. I walked away before she could respond. 3 months after the ruling, Smith Mountain Lake was quiet the way I'd always loved it. Not empty, there's a difference between empty and quiet. Empty feels abandoned, quiet feels healed. I stood on the dock one October morning with a coffee warming my hands while fog drifted in slow silver sheets across the water. The air smelled like pine and cold. Frank loved mornings exactly like this. Said the lake looked honest before sunrise, no boats, no noise, no one performing anything. I was starting to understand what he meant. Anna visited almost every weekend now with my grandchildren Caleb and Nora. Something had shifted between us after the trial. For years, she had seen me only as mom, reliable, steady, predictable. Now she looked at me differently, with curiosity, with something that felt carefully like awe. One Saturday afternoon, Caleb found an old photograph tucked inside a drawer in the guest bedroom. He brought it to me on the porch with the particular urgency children reserve for discoveries they don't yet understand. Grandma, is this really you? The photograph was taken in Germany in 1996. I was 38, in full dress uniform beside a courtroom podium. Dark hair, sharp posture, eyes that had already seen too much. Yes, I said. He studied it carefully. You look scary. I laughed harder than I had in months. Well, I told him, sometimes that helped. He thought about that seriously, the way children do when an answer surprises them by making sense. Then he nodded. Mom says you were a colonel. I was. Like in the movies. Nothing like in the movies. That's something else age teaches you, if you let it. Real strength usually looks quieter than the version on television. Real courage often appears tired. Real integrity almost never announces itself. About a month after the trial, Evelyn called. I almost didn't answer. I had every reason not to. But I picked up because I had learned, over 62 years, that unfinished bitterness weighs more than conversation. Always. We met at a small diner between Norfolk and the lake. Brown coffee mugs, pancake specials, a waitress who called everyone honey and meant it. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes late in a plain gray coat, no pearls, no designer suit, no performance. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked orty. Nary, somehow that made her look older. We sat across from each other while rain tapped the windows. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I was angry at Frank for years, she said finally. I said nothing. He always chose you over the family, every time. She looked down at the table. When he got sick, I think I panicked. I thought if I controlled the estate, the property, her voice broke slightly, maybe I wouldn't lose him completely. And there it was, not greed, not really. Fear. Fear wearing the mask of control. I had seen it 100 times in military court. People harming others not from cruelty but from terror of loss, of irrelevance, of being left behind. Evelyn had spent 30 years slowly losing her son to a life she couldn't manage. And at the end, instead of sitting quietly beside him on that dock, she had fought for a piece of wood and cedar shingles. I loved him too, I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes immediately. I know that now. That sentence carried more weight than any courtroom ruling. Later that winter, I received a handwritten note from Judge Bennett. Short, no formalities. He congratulated me on preserving both my husband's wishes and my own dignity, then wrote one line I've returned to many times since. Some people spend their entire lives chasing authority. Very few learn when to carry it quietly. I read that 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the leather case beside Frank's navy blanket. Because that had been the real journey all along. Not hiding weakness, hiding exhaustion. After 20 years of service, after difficult prosecutions, after sitting beside Frank through 14 months of cancer, I hadn't wanted authority anymore. I had wanted peace. But peace without self-respect eventually becomes surrender, and there is a very important difference between the two. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Anna and the kids stayed overnight at the lake house. After dinner, after the dishes, after Caleb fell asleep on the couch clutching that old military photograph, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The lake reflected moonlight in long silver ribbons. Cold air filled my lungs completely, and for the first time since Frank died, the silence didn't hurt. It comforted. I thought about what Caleb had asked me earlier, in that direct way children ask questions because they haven't yet learned to soften them. Were you really important? And I had told him the truth. I was useful. He'd nodded as if that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. At 62, being useful feels more meaningful than being important, more honest, more lasting. Frank knew that. He never wanted a monument. He wanted a dock he'd built himself, a woman who'd stay beside him in the quiet, and enough mornings left to watch the fog lift off the water. I couldn't give him more time, but I gave him what came after. The memory of him, undistorted, unchanged, exactly as he was. And no one is ever taking that.